And if there is ever to be peace in the Middle East, much of the credit will go to Richard Nixon, who guaranteed Israel's survival in the Yom Kippur War.
That was former President Gerald Ford, December 1998, Yorba Linda, California, an event held in his honor by the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. This episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly launches on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year in the Jewish calendar. It's a reflective day centered on atonement and repentance, remembering the past while beginning the Jewish New Year. And for this podcast in 2025, it's an opportunity to remember Yom Kippur from a different year, 1973, when war broke out in the Middle East and an American president was drawn into the conflict. Less than a year before he resigned the presidency because of Watergate, Richard Nixon played a leading role in coming to Israel's rescue. We'll hear firsthand accounts from President Nixon and others who were with him at the time. October 6, 1973. It was Yom Kippur, and it was day one of the Yom Kippur War. Unfamiliar with the war or can't remember the details? Here's a quick history told by Ben Stein. He was a speechwriter and lawyer to President Richard Nixon. Ben Stein spoke at a 2010 event hosted by the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum.
When Egypt and Syria, with immense Soviet help, invaded Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis were caught in a vise of their own flat-footedness and the super high-end anti-aircraft missiles supplied by the Soviets. These missiles and their very, very advanced radars nullified the usual Israeli air superiority. The Egyptians and Syrians were pouring across the canal, pouring across the Golan Heights, and they seemed to be unstoppable. Mrs. Meir, who had made serious mistakes in confronting what she had been told were imminent invasion plans, had already laid out suicide pills for her to take. Richard Nixon, whom confused minds to this day accuse of being an anti-Semite, leapt to Israel's defense in a way no other president ever had. Acting with the brilliant guidance of Henry Kissinger, he airlifted to Israel the most up-to-date black box electric countermeasures and rockets for jamming and destroying the Soviet-supplied SAMs and their radars. Within hours, these weapons started showing up on the battlefield, and the tide of battle turned. It was a dramatic and very, very frightening time. Israel was considering the nuclear option. This made it possible for Israel to stalemate the Egyptians without using the nuclear option. When the Israelis crossed the Red Sea and had surrounded one of the Egyptian armies and were about to surround Cairo, the Russians hinted that they would send ground forces to help the Egyptians fight Israel. Nixon saw their bluff and called it and went to DEFCON 3, a state of military readiness that told the Russians we would use every means to stop them. Every means. The Russians backed down, the Egyptians and the Israelis signed a ceasefire.
And more history, this time from Robert McFarlane. He was President Reagan's national security advisor, and during the Nixon administration, he was military assistant to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. In 2014, Robert McFarlane spoke to the Nixon Foundation.
It was the resilience, strength, really, of President Nixon. For remember the circumstances. Here was an American ally, Israel, attacked from two sides, Syria and Egypt, and losing. And it looked for about a week's time as though Israel was going to suffer a pretty serious defeat. President Nixon, however, here, seeing the importance of avoiding that catastrophe, was himself besieged by the Watergate challenge. He was back over a year now into this worsening crisis and attacked by members of Congress and others and the press, and an ally was about to go under. So it required a personal composure and vision of where he wanted this to end to be able to continue to manage this NSC system with the aid of Dr. Kissinger and subordinates in State Department as well as Defense. Bear in mind that in addition to the pressures of Watergate, his vice president was about to resign. Separately, the Soviet Union, who had its own interest in trying to get back into the Middle East, was looking for ways to undermine American policy, to the point of even alerting 7 airborne divisions to go back into Egypt and to tip the balance in favor of Egypt. You had threats by the Arab countries to impose an oil embargo, which would or could have brought down not only our economy, but the global economy. And so this is not your average afternoon walk in the park if you're the president facing these kind of stresses. But throughout, and indeed the vice president did resign in that first 2-week period of October, the president was there to make the decision, and there was never any question about who was in charge. The reallocation of things coming off the Defense Department production line for American units were just sent immediately to Israel. The battlefield was turned around so that Israel could avoid being defeated.
Now, let's hear directly from Richard Nixon. Nearly 2 decades after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, he appeared on C-SPAN's Book Notes. In February 1992, Richard Nixon discussed his book, Seize the Moment, America's Challenge in a One Superpower World.
Again, a lot of our callers will call up and talk to our guests and suggest the only reason why we're giving so much money to Israel is because of the Israeli lobby. How do you view that?
I know that bashing the Israeli lobby seems to be a problem these days. Let me say in that respect, one of those who's been criticized for that is my old friend and associate, and you know him well, Pat Buchanan. Now, Pat Buchanan may say outrageous things, and he does, but when people say he's anti-Semitic, I remember that in the Yom Kippur War, when I ordered a huge airlift, which Golda Meir said saved Israel, that the strongest supporter within the administration for that airlift was Pat Buchanan. Now, anybody who supported airlift for Israel is not anti-Semitic. But I would say that looking at the situation today by the Israeli lobby, of course there's an Israeli lobby. There's also an Irish lobby for Northern Ireland. There are various lobbies, as we know. There are lobbies for Croatia. I hear from them when I wrote a recent piece on Croatia, for Poland, etc. But what I am suggesting is that in this instance, that the fact that we are supporting Israel is in our interest and in their interest up to a point. But when it comes, as it does, to the occasion, when it no longer serves Israel's interest or our interest, then we've got to try to support a peace process. That's why the peace process at the present time must go forward. I'm not sure it will succeed, but what I would urge to my friends in the Israeli community, what I would urge to them is go into it with an open mind. Find a way to break this impasse, because you just can't continue to have a situation where we're pouring all that money into the Israeli-Egyptian area, which could be used for other purposes.
And here's Richard Nixon again in 1991, an interview about President Dwight Eisenhower. Richard Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president, is discussing Eisenhower's policies in the Middle East.
Let's look at some of the Eisenhower decisions that were made. They were all controversial. The first one is the decision that he made in 1953 with regard to Iran. The United States, together with Britain, participated in supporting a coup in Iran that got rid of Mossadegh, who was a left-leaning Soviet, frankly, controlled leader of Iran, and restored the Shah to the power in Iran. Now, he is criticized for that, for the CIA's role in it, but let's see what it meant. Iran was the most important country in the area. It had the most people. It had oil at that time, not as much as some others, but plenty, and therefore was a great force. By restoring the Shah to power, it meant that the United States had a friend in Iran, a very strong friend. And for 25 years, Iran played a role as a peacekeeper in the Persian Gulf area. One striking example, in 1973, when I was president, you'll remember the Yom Kippur War. And at that time, all of the producers of oil in the Persian Gulf cut off the sale of oil to Israel, except Iran. That would not have happened if Mossadegh, the one that the CIA got thrown out, had been in power. It happened because Eisenhower, in his wisdom, did support those forces that restored the Shah, and we had the Shah in power at that time. And now that the Shah has left, as he did in the Carter administration when he's replaced by Khomeini, Iran has become a wild card, a little weakened at the present time, but still very important.
Richard Nixon resigned as president in 1974. He was replaced by his vice president, Gerald Ford. During the 1976 presidential campaign, the Yom Kippur War got a mention in the second presidential debate. In fact, that debate between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter was held on October 6th, the same date that the Yom Kippur War began 13 years earlier. Here's Jimmy Carter.
Also in 1975, we almost brought Israel to their knees after the Yom Kippur War by the so-called reassessment of our relationship to Israel. We, in effect, tried to make Israel the scapegoat for the problems in the Middle East. And this weakened our relationships with Israel a great deal and put a cloud on the total commitment that our people feel toward the Israelis. There ought to be a clear, unequivocal commitment without change to Israel.
The Yom Kippur War occurred at the same time Watergate consumed President Nixon. In fact, the Saturday Night Massacre happened right during the war, on October 20th, 1973, a week before the Yom Kippur War ended. We've heard several mentions of Henry Kissinger. Now let's hear directly from him. Henry Kissinger wrote a book about the Yom Kippur War. It was his 15th book, and he talked about it on Book TV in December 2003 during another Middle East war. In this clip, President Nixon's Secretary of State connects the Yom Kippur War with Watergate.
Nixon had extraordinary knowledge about foreign policy, and he was essentially extremely decisive. But he had to spend a good deal of his physical time simply on the legal requirements of Watergate, and a good deal of his emotional time. And he still had so much prestige around the world for the decisiveness with which he had acted in the previous years that it did not impair us as much as you would think from studying political science textbooks. But it was my nightmare constantly. And every time we made a decisive move, we were faced with answering the question, are you doing this in order to protect the president, or is the president doing it to protect himself from Watergate?
Also noting the timing of the Yom Kippur War and Watergate, McGill University history professor Gil Troy. In December 2016, Professor Troy spoke at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum.
The real tension is the resupply. Nixon, who supports the state of Israel, has a good friendship with Golda Meir. Now again, let's put context. It's October 1973. The Watergate burglary had occurred in 1972, in June 1972. Re-election, massive re-election, November 1972. But January, February, March, April 1973, and then July 1973 with the Senate, drip, 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 the Watergate revelations are coming out. Nixon's frustrated. Nixon's terrified. And Nixon now has an opportunity to lead. And he finally says, everybody's saying, don't do it, be wary. He says, you know, we would take as much heat for sending 3 C-5As as for sending 30, so let's do it. In fact, he says, and I'm quoting, God damn it, use everyone we have. Tell them to send everything that can fly. When Golda Meir hears that, she cries. When the Israeli people, feeling so abandoned, so alone, so terrified, see those planes coming in over Tel Aviv, they sing on the streets of Tel Aviv, God bless America. And Richard Nixon is seen as the savior of the state of Israel.
Gil Troy noted Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir's reaction to President Richard Nixon's involvement in the war. So too did Pat Buchanan, a Nixon aide. Pat Buchanan spoke at a January 2013 celebration marking the 100th anniversary of Nixon's birth, hosted by the Nixon Foundation.
In his second term, he would order the strategic airlift that saved Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Israel never had a better friend, said Golda Meir.
And a historical footnote. Now a life-size sculpture of Golda Meir can be found inside the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. And now a bonus clip. It's from C-SPAN's 2013 feature series on First Ladies, the episode spotlighting Pat Nixon. Since we've been hearing about Golda Meir and Richard Nixon, from the Nixon Presidential Library, here's curator Olivia Anastasiadis.
Here in the museum, we have a lot of examples of gifts that were given to Mrs. Nixon during her foreign travels. This is one of the oldest pieces in the collection. It was a gift to Mrs. Nixon from Golda Meir in November of 1969. It is a carnelian necklace. It's 12th through 11th century BC.
That's it for this episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly. Thanks for listening, happy searching, and Happy New Year.